We are now living in a time of a deep crisis of the credibility of the institutions that we have. And I think this has been exacerbated by the crisis in Gaza and by the inability by many Western countries, I would argue, not Norway, but many of our colleagues who have hesitated to use the same type of language against violations of international humanitarian law, for instance, that we easily apply when they are violated by Russia in Ukraine. When it comes to Gaza, we have...
This was Espen Barth Eide, Norway's foreign minister, speaking at the World Economic Forum in April. It was a remarkable swipe at Norway's own allies, the so-called West, and what he perceived as a double standard between Ukraine and Gaza. At stake is the very international order established at the end of the Second World War, built on the foundations of multilateral institutions and international law. So is there a double standard? And what new global alliances might emerge from a paralyzed United Nations? Today, I speak with Stein Tønnesson, Research Professor Emeritus and former Director of PRIO. We are also joined by Gérard Araud, former French ambassador to the UN and the United States. I am Arnaud Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Stein, Ambassador Araud, welcome to this episode. Stein, I know from conversations we've been having, you and I, that you're not a fan of the concept of the West. But for our listeners, and before we dive into some of the issues that seem to be pitting some Western countries, at least, against others, could you elaborate on why you find it problematic? Do you think it oversimplifies global dynamics?
Well, I've never personally felt like belonging to a West. I'm a European, and it's perfectly fine for me to talk about Western Europe and Eastern Europe because you have a point of reference in Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe. But I don't think there exists anything like a global West, a global North, a global South. Instead, I want to speak about continents in a traditional way.
And despite these reservations, do you acknowledge any usefulness in the term for framing certain geopolitical discussions?
Only if we are careful about defining the point we are looking at the world from. For instance, the British imperialists, for them it would be natural to place Greenwich in the middle and have a Western and Eastern hemisphere. For Chinese, it's not China that is the name for the nation, but it's Zhongguo, which means the Middle Kingdom. The Roman Empire had the Mediterranean, which I understand the Chinese used to call the West Arab Sea. So it always depends on where you are, and I try to situate myself in the part of the world that I'm talking about, and then the cardinal directions do not make much sense.
I'm going to move now to Ambassador Araud from the sort of practicalities around this. Ambassador, you were France's permanent representative to the UN from 2009 to 2014, a period which saw the 2011 intervention in Libya, the Council largely stuck on Syria, and the situation in Mali. In these instances, did you perceive any alignment of the West, particularly France, the UK, and the US, the three permanent members at the UN Security Council, in opposition to other member states within the Council?
I think I will start by telling you, in a contradictory way to what I think in terms of geopolitics, saying, really, does the West exist in geopolitical terms? I don't think so. But it's as a sort of a contrast or contradiction for a lot of other countries. For the rest, you may argue that the West exists. I was struck when I was at the UN, really at the UN Security Council, but also at the UN General Assembly, how much I felt a resentment of the rest against the West. A resentment based first on the colonization, which of course, has been largely a Western endeavor. A resentment against the United States with their military interventions. Right now, the Americans and the British, by the way, are bombing the Houthis in Yemen. Why not? But really on the basis of which mandate? And which result, there is no accountability about the West. And I think the best example of this total lack of accountability has been, of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was not only illegal, which was not only a major geopolitical blunder, but which actually cost the life of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Immediately, you can argue saying, well, that's a good example, but France and Germany opposed the invasion of Iraq. So why do you talk about the West? The fact is that for the rest of the world, it has been a Western invasion. Third point, the fact is also that the West is largely dominating the West, the US, and behind the US, its allies, that the West is largely dominating the multilateral institutions. If you look at the UN, really, right now, the Secretary General is Portuguese and it was South Koreans, and really the Assistant Secretary General in charge of peacekeeping is French, in charge of political affairs is American, in charge of humanitarian affairs is British. If you look at the World Bank, if you look at the International Monetary Fund, it's the same. So the impression of the rest of the world is that there is a Western domination, that the West is doing more or less whatever it wants, and is practicing the double standard, which is very, very important. Double standard, I've quoted Iraq, but as you can guess, right now, what is happening in Gaza is really feeding a very strong anti-Western narrative in the rest of the world. And sorry to be long, and going back to your real question, in the UN Security Council, yes, there was on most issues, I could tell you two minor issues where there were differences between the Western powers, but on most issues, there was very clearly a unity of the West. And I should add also that really, since you were referring to the UN Security Council, that the West has the majority in the UN Security Council. You know, there are 15 members, but if the majority is 9, let's say that 75% of the times, the West has the 9 votes. You know, if you had the Eastern Europeans, the Western Europeans, the Latin Americans, it depends largely on the Latin Americans, if it's Venezuela or if it's another Latin American countries, it makes a difference. But most of the time, the West has the majority, which explains also that Russia and China are obliged to use the veto more often than we do.
Ambassador, you mentioned Gaza, and I want to ask you specifically about that. There is indeed a view that Western countries have been giving Israel a large diplomatic blanket to bombard and displace hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. In particular, the US has been repeating that Israel has the right to defend itself following the October 7th attacks, and has issued multiple vetoes at the Security Council regarding a ceasefire. So, Ambassador, how has the reputation of Western nations, particularly the US, been impacted on the global stage on the issue of Gaza?
The fact is, if you want to understand what is happening, you have always, using a French expression, to put yourself in the shoes of the other side. So let's try to be somebody in New Delhi or Jakarta. Every time a rocket is falling on a city in Ukraine, the Europeans and Americans, are screaming. And in a sense, we are right to scream. It's an obvious violation of humanitarian law. But now in Gaza, we have reached a point of 40,000 people killed, the majority of them being obviously civilians with thousands of children. And the fact, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself, but Israel has also to respect the basic premises of the law of war. And we hardly protest, really, we don't sanction, we don't react. And you have this endless military operation. Nobody is able to tell us what will be the outcome of this operation, when it will be the outcome of the operation. And again, hundreds of civilians are in a daily manner, are killed. And we don't react. And not only we don't react, but the Israelis are using American bombs to do it. So it's really, frankly, again, as good. I'm not sure I'm good, but as a diplomat, I could argue at the UN Security Council to explain the policy of my country, the policy of the West. Because whatever we say, there is hardly any substantial difference between the United States and the Europeans. Europeans are moaning a bit more louder. It's a bit louder, but it doesn't have any substantial consequence. So you have Gaza on one side, this endless operation, this really, the strip has been raised. Let's try to think of what will be the future of these 2 million of Palestinians. And the other side, you have the settlers in the West Bank who are committing, really numerous crimes at the expense of the civilian, the Palestinians. And again, we do nothing. We do nothing, and it's obviously resented by the rest of the world. We are losing our moral leadership, if we have had a moral leadership, actually.
Stein, Ambassador Araud mentioned the double standard between Ukraine and Gaza. And a lot of the criticism goes that way. On the one hand, we see extraordinary support for Kyiv on military and aid, but also on the diplomatic front with vast coordinated sanctions against Russia for violating Ukraine's sovereignty. On the other hand, the West is pulling its strong military and financial might in support of Israel, which is used in part to maintain the military occupation and conduct very deadly operations in Gaza. Over 40,000 deaths in just 10 months in the enclave, most of them civilian deaths, as Ambassador Araud just said. And no broad sanctions against Israel so far, despite the International Criminal Court seeking arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on charges of war crimes, and the International Court of Justice saying it was plausible Israel was violating the Genocide Convention in Gaza. So, with all that in mind, do you believe this criticism is justified?
To some extent, but I think that Netanyahu is despised almost in the same way as Putin now. And there is also a basic difference between those two wars. The war in Gaza is a war of an overwhelmingly strong power against a population organized by a group that has to hide all the time. And there is this very strong engagement, I perceive, in Europe on behalf of the Palestinian struggle against Israel. And this is different from the United States. So I think that the resentment that is felt against this concept of the West is mainly due to US role as a patron of Israel today. But when it comes to Ukraine, then there is a difference, because this is seen as in Europe and felt in Europe as an attack on us as Europeans. The Ukrainians are a part of Europe, and this is obvious aggression against us. So where you see a humanitarian engagement in Europe on behalf of the Palestinians, you see a total feeling of solidarity with Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. So it's not the humanitarian concern primarily. It's not very much of a concern for making peace either, but it's for Ukraine to win. And you now see the Ukrainian flag waving all over the place.
I think, again, I want to support what has just been said, because the fact is that a large part of the anti-Western resentment is actually an anti-American resentment, I remember Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State of President Clinton, told me once, really nobody loves the big boy on the block. And that's a fact. The US, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has become what the French minister was calling a hyperpower. And hubris is never far from hyperpower. And the US in the last 30 years has used force, really. There is also a saying that when you have a big hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And it's a fact that the US in the last 30 years has used a lot of force. Military has launched a lot of military operations throughout the world, and it has fed a strong resentment. On our side, on the side of the Europeans, yes, I know that, for instance, that Norway has been very vocal in the Gaza tragedy, and actually there was some retaliation coming from Jerusalem. And we, the French, we have opposed the intervention in Iraq. But the fact is that, in a sense, for the rest of the world, we are put a bit in the same bag, because they know that at the end of the day, we'll be on the American side. that basically we are belonging to the same alliance, in a sense, to the same civilization.
And that's partly because of this concept of the West, which is deplorable.
Yes, I agree. It doesn't make sense, but that's a fact. If you really go in the streets of New Delhi or Jakarta, or really for them, for the people, the West has a meaning, as a civilization, as a way of looking at human rights, at democracy, and so on. Which means that we are on one side very much criticized, seen as violent, brutal, imperialist. The other side, there is also a lot of envy for what the West represents.
Ambassador Araud, I want to take us back to the UN Security Council for just a moment and its credibility as an institution fit for purpose these days. At the end of March, the Security Council passed Resolution 2728. It was near unanimous, with only the US abstaining from voting, and that resolution was calling for a ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages. But then the US said that resolution was non-binding. Ambassador Araud, you've sat at that table with other representatives and taken part to many such negotiations and resolutions. Do you think the undermining of such resolutions by powerful members like the United States or the multiple use of vetoes is pushing other nations towards alternative international forums or alliances?
First, in legal terms, because it's a vexing issue, the position of the US totally doesn't have really any basis. Resolution is always mandatory. It's not because it is under Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 that it makes a difference. Chapter 7 says that you can use force to implement it. Chapter 6 doesn't allow you to use force to implement it. But nevertheless, it's legally binding. But it's an old story on the American side. But the International Court of Justice is very clear on that. These resolutions are binding indeed. Let's go back to the UN itself. People forget that actually the UN means United Nations, which means that it works only if the nations are united. People forget that between 1949 or 1950 and 1991, really basically the UN was very, very often really didn't act on major conflicts because simply the US and the USSR were blocking the UN Security Council working. As soon as the interest of great powers is at stake, you can be sure that the UN is totally unable to act. On the Middle East conflict, the US has always prevented the UN Security Council from acting, or has used the UN Security Council as a sort of a stamp, ask the Council to give a stamp to something which had been decided out of the Council. And the Russians did the same with Syria and now with Ukraine, and China did the same with Myanmar and Sri Lanka. So that's a fact. It's the choice of the veto, which has been made in 1945 to avoid going back to the League of Nations between the two world wars, which have seen all the major powers leaving the room one after the other. Italy, Japan, Germany, and eventually the USSR. So you give the veto to the great powers so they don't leave the room if they have a problem. So there have always been a sort of discrepancy between, on one side, the expectation of the public opinion, the United Nations, the will of the humankind, in a sense, to reach peace and to promote dialogue, and the reality of the game of powers, the traditional game of powers. So we have had a UN quite active simply because there was the American supremacy, and the Russia and China didn't dare confront it. And it was the case between 1991 until maybe 2010 or 2015. Now it's over. Russia is back. China is a great power. So and the relationship between the three great powers is confrontational. Unfortunately, my forecast is that the UN will be more or less paralyzed as long as the US and China and Russia are really, as I've said, in quite a confrontational, their relationship is quite confrontational.
Stein, Ambassador Araud just said that we might see a UN paralyzed for the foreseeable future. So on that question of global governance, are we seeing a growing divide between how Western and non-Western nations view global governance, particularly in the context of these conflicts? And if so, with what consequences?
The United States has long perceived of itself as the guarantor of global security and global governance, also in the economic field. This self-perceived role suffered greatly under Trump with his Make America Great Again, because that was more isolationist and built also on tariffs, trade war against China. And he also more or less destroyed the State Department and diplomacy, also by the shifts of secretaries and advisors so often. Biden has rebuilt some of this and has had a very successful alliance policy, but just as much directed against China as it was under Trump. It's one of the only things that they agree on in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats, is anti-China sentiment. That same China, it's an authoritarian party state. It has terrible problems in its foreign policy, but it also is engaged in trying to establish itself as a responsible, global, security-oriented power. If Trump is re-elected, then China, Xi Jinping, gets a big chance to get many countries around the world to accept a kind of Chinese leadership. And China has played its hand quite carefully by keeping in contact with all sides, mediating between countries that are opposed to each other, like Iran and Saudi Arabia. And we have also seen a mediation inside the war-ravaged Myanmar today. This is going to be a struggle between probably something that many people will call East and West, where the East is China and the West is again the United States. I'm very afraid of that. I hope there is a chance to overcome this and, under President Harris, rebuild some kind of sensible policy towards China that does not provoke China to become just an ally or partner of Russia and North Korea.
Right. You mentioned Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee running against Donald Trump. But under Biden, we saw some moves by the Democrats that were seen as very provocative by Beijing, particularly the visit of then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan in August 2022.
Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is in Taiwan tonight, and China is already responding. Pelosi's late night...
So, Stein, how do you see the role of the West, particularly the U.S. and its allies, evolving in that region?
I think Biden has been irresponsible in things that he has said about Taiwan that has undermined the compromise that was reached in the 1970s between China and the United States. And hopefully there will be a return to reason where the United States will make absolutely clear that it does not support any independence for Taiwan. Taiwan is at the same time China's Achilles heel, because China insists on unification with Taiwan and sees that as a core interest of China, a kind of sacred mission to reunify with China. But that reunification has become impossible to achieve peacefully because the Taiwanese no longer feel like Chinese. They now consider themselves to be Taiwanese only, a majority of them. And this is much influenced also by the treatment that China has given to Hong Kong, which has had repercussions in Taiwan and Taiwan's attitudes. So actually, China would need time to gradually give up its designs on Taiwan. If it decides to use force against Taiwan, that will be a catastrophe, not just for Taiwan, but also for China. It could lead to a World War III, but it could also lead to the destruction of China, which, by the way, is now also in serious economic trouble. So China needs a functioning global system and must stand back vis-à-vis Taiwan. I think that many countries in the world, both in the south, north, west, and everywhere, have a duty to try to help improve relations between China and the United States, so one can avoid these worse and these really disastrous scenarios.
Ambassador Araud, as we wrap this episode, Stein mentioned a possible China-led order in response to a US-led order. So could the growing criticism from the Global South lead to a shift in global power dynamics?
Well, first, I do agree with everything has just been said about China. And if I may say, I hope that the Europeans will not gang behind the Americans. As it really, for a lot of Europeans, considering that the Americans are doing their job in Ukraine, there may be a temptation of saying, oh, we should do the same with the Americans versus China. I think we, the Europeans, we have a role to play to be maybe not the go-between, but for instance, working with the other Asian countries, because they are between the rock and the hard place. And they are quite important countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines. They don't want to choose their camp. But they want to keep good relationship with the US and with China. They need a sort of political margin of maneuvering. So we, the Europeans, in a sense, we should play this role. And a country like Norway really certainly can. And I hope that my own country will do it. Yes, answering to your question, we are living a major change in the balance of power. And it's precisely, in a sense, I should say, the problem of foreign policy and international relations today. We have been living an unnatural period of total supremacy of the United States and of its allies and partners of the West. It's over. It's over, as I've said. Russia is back. India really is playing a role. And China now is another superpower. So we are living in a period of transition, and it's always a difficult period. Let's be frank. The US is not very good at managing a balanced and multilateral system. The US is clinging to its status of the only power. So it's a dangerous period. And as I've said, there's really, as for the relationship with China, I think the Europeans, while being good allies of the United States, we should also play our role. Really, we should talk to everybody, basically, and to talk with everybody, in a sense, on the footing of equality. We should talk to the Indians, understanding that we can disagree, that their own conception of their own interest, that some interest, really we can disagree on some issues. So I should say we should really call back the diplomats and send back the soldiers to their barracks.
I agree very much with the ambassador, and I would like to say, perhaps as my final statement, that I think that what China could do to improve its standing in the world now would be to help Russia out of its murderous quagmire in Ukraine through a negotiated armistice.
Ambassador Araud, Stein, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Arnaud Siad and edited by Brage Pedersen, with sounds from CNN, the World Economic Forum, and PBS. Follow us on social media and PRIO.org to get our latest research, policy briefs, and blog posts.